Hello, everybody. Welcome. So, part of how I learn, I'm sorry to say, is by being intellectually impetuous, precocious, and naive. And what that usually turns out to mean, or what that often turns out to mean, is that I'm going to make bold mistakes in my first assays of an idea that will sort of fertilize the garden of my mind, if I'm lucky. If I'm unlucky, those bold mistakes become doctrine, dogma, or my pet theory. And that happens too. This is part of the danger of trying to chase insight alone, right? So that I don't have to fight anyone powerful who's got an objection or a contrary perspective. And this is part of why I've been willing to put up with my scientist friend Kevin for 15 years or something, 20 years. Because he only fights me. He nearly never agrees with anything I've thought, believed, perceived, and so forth. And he's very adept in the intellectual confines of argument or debate. I wonder if we'll hear some coyotes because of the siren. Let's see. Sorry about that devastating oral attack. I suppose I could edit it out, but it seems useful. I'm seeing something really interesting here. Okay, so there's a three-pronged pine needle floating in midair and moving around on the breeze. And the closest branch it could be connected to is probably a minimum of 15 feet away. And the branch it's probably connected to is 25 feet away. Oh shit. Oh yeah, there it is. Wow. Okay, so, Alright, this is even weirder than I thought. Because the branch it actually appears to be connected to is not above it. That's funny. My Blue Jay friend just flew right past my face to wake me up to the fact that it's here. All right, so what's actually going on isn't what is apparent, and this is the problem with ideas. It certainly looked, I'm going to have to test this, which is sort of frightening because I don't want to change. I want to understand something about the situation without modifying the situation. And this is the problem with knowledge and perspective, is that often it is impossible to determine what is the case without so severely disturbing the case, quote unquote, that we cannot, our first moves wrong foot us for all future moves. So I'm trying to understand this, what I'm looking at, which is a triad of dry pine needles floating, apparently floating in the atmosphere. And what I'm trying to understand is, and it seems very unlikely that this is the case, but it is possible, because spiders are crazy amazing in their abilities to forge what I call anchor strands for webs. And that's what this is a spider kite. It's an anchor strand kite. So a spider at some point in very recent history has attached a web and originally I thought the web that was attached was from the kite up. But I can see that there's a web from the kite sideways. What I can't tell is if there are two webs, because the kite is behaving as if there are two. And I don't really want to disturb it, but I'm going to try to determine the movement of the kite is so counterintuitive. I can't understand what is lofting the kite if the only web is to the side, because excuse me, when the wind is reduced, the kite should fall, and it does fall some, but not enough. And so it appears, what I'm looking at, it just doesn't seem possible, but it is. I don't think there's a second strand attached above it, but the way the kite is flying, it appears that there would have to be two strands. I don't think there is. I tried to test it. Again, the problem with something this delicate, well, first of all, it might be safer to test than I thought, because it's most likely that the web strand is not sticky. Okay, I've just figured it out. There are two strands. One is invisible. Okay, that makes sense. Now the behavior of the kite makes sense. I cannot see the second strand, but I could interfere with it. Wow. So now, now I really don't understand how the object was formed, because I can understand the spider attaching, there's the second strand. I can see it now. But from the opposite angle I can see it. Okay, and both of them go to the side. But what I can't understand, what seems impossible to me, is how the spider got this kite in the middle of what appears to be two strands. Yeah, no idea. It just seems impossible. I can imagine the spider attaching the kite, dumping the strand from a high branch. I have no idea how the kite could be in the middle of two strands. No idea. I'm gonna take a picture of this just for kicks. So I'm gonna pause. Oh wait, I can take a picture without stopping the recording. effectively invisible in the photograph. Very blurry in that one. A little, yeah, useless. All right. Forgive my throat clearing. Yeah, it seems impossible. I'm looking at it. I'm sure there was a method that produced this seemingly absurd impossibility. And I've seen stuff like this before. Spider kites are amazing. And if you actually look at large webs, particularly those of orb weavers, and it turns out that this topic is covalent to the topic I'm going to stumble into with great impetuous ignorance in a little bit. If you look at the large webs, particularly of orb weavers, and you actually try to understand, it's not too hard to understand how the web is constructed once the anchor strands are in place. But if you try to understand how the anchor strands were forged, whew, good luck. You're going to have to see it happen, or, have an entomologist. I don't know if there are arachnologists. There probably are. Study arachnids. But yeah, you're going to have someone explain it to you. And until you actually see it happen, if you carefully think about the web and you look at it, it's going to look impossible to produce many of the anchor strands, and especially to connect them at tension in the center of the web. And this turns out to be correlated with the topic that I intend to pursue here, as soon as I manage to effectively clear my throat, which I will not do in your ear. Let's see. Okay. So, I think before I even get to the topic, I'm going to talk about the web some more. The world line of an organism can be imagined as the size, shape, space-time tunnel that an organism traverses during its lifetime. Now, it should be obvious that the world lines of other similar organisms are productive of the world line of a single organism, i.e. a human baby has two parents, two immediate parents. Unclear. There's a problem with trying to compute the number of progenitors of a human, because there's a problem where, and even the common answers to the problem don't actually solve the problem, as far as I understand it. I'd love to be corrected about that, because this is something that has bothered me for a long time. It looks like as you go backward in time with two ancestors, my dad had two ancestors, my mom had two ancestors, so that's 4. They each had two ancestors, so that's 8. 16, etc. You have the chessboard problem of 1 grain of sand on each, n+1 grains of rice on each. Is that it? Is it n+1? No, you double the grains of rice, so it's n to the x, n to the 1, 2, 3, 4 powers as you traverse the chessboard. Long time ago, it is claimed, some astute mathematician was offered a reward by a king or queen for having solved a problem, and they requested 1 grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard, 2 on the next, 4 on the next, and so forth. And at first glance, this looks like a paltry sum. But if you understand the nature of powers, you'll realize that on the final square you'll have, I don't know, more grains of rice than there are on Earth or something. A ridiculously large amount of grains of rice. So, organisms have a world line. And for the purposes of our discussion, and I may even be misunderstanding the world line, because I often do misunderstand complex principles from science, not having had to mathematically validate them myself. So I can have a naive understanding of things. And it's not uncommon for me to do so. It is uncommon for me to notice in real time that my understanding is or is likely naive. But, okay, where am I going here? So imagine that a ovum in my mother's womb has a world line, and it is the size and shape of an ovum, and it is traveling inside my mother's womb, so it's tracing. Imagine that we light it up and we make a tracer backward and forward in time. It appears sometime during or after her embryogenesis, probably after, I would guess. There's a light, and it's the size of an ovum. And it makes a tunnel as it travels through time. And then eventually it meets another light the size of a sperm, which has been doing some traveling in my father's testicles. And it meets these two lights that make a tunneled shape, a tunnel of their shape in time-space, right? So wherever my mom goes on the surface of the Earth, that changes the tunnel's trajectories. The Earth is spinning, so that changes the trajectories. The Earth is orbiting the sun, so we're going to follow it inside my dad's body, on the surface of the Earth, around the surface of the Earth's spin, around the Earth's orbit of the sun, and then around the sun's orbit in the galaxy, and then around the galaxy's orbits or movements in the universe. And you'll get exactly one tunnel, sperm-size shaped, and ovum-size shaped. And then these two meet, and my world line begins there. So at first I am the size of an ovum with an embedded sperm head in it. And then, it becomes a multicellular blastocyst, and so forth, and becomes Darren. So first I'm baby-shaped, and my world line is baby-shaped and sized, and then as I get older it gets bigger and more complex, more numbers of cells. And actually each of those cells has a world line, each of the bacteria in me, each of the viruses. So I'm kind of a galaxy of world lines if we're taking my components. Okay, so why am I saying all this? Because the spider is insanely brilliant. What the spider does with its own body, with no artificial technology, the spider extends its world line so that in time-space, the world line of the spider is always extended by any web it is presently occupying or connected to. And that means that the world line of a spider has a secondary element, the web. And the web is literally, at least where the web is not, spiders do all kinds of things with webs. They don't just make the webs, the capture webs, right? They also make various kinds of travel webs. And they probably make and discard webs as they're attempting to forge a capture web. One moment. All right. So, so the world line of a spider has two components at minimum. The spider and the web. Now notice that what the web does is it literally filters time-space to capture the world lines of other insects, which it then consumes. It probably doesn't consume all of the insects that intersect with its web, but the spider has two world lines, the spider-shaped one extended by the web-shaped one. And that's pretty astonishing. Okay, so here comes the more complicated thing. The spider web is an object with an organismal origin. There's no chance you will encounter one that has neither an organismal origin nor a mechanical origin. And a mechanical origin, in the way that I'm going to use this word, has an organismal origin because it means something built robots to build spider webs. Now, I differ with many scientists. Particularly Lex Fridman, in that I have a limited definition of the word machine. And because I haven't had to refine it in careful argument, it's probably fairly clumsy. But it goes something like a non-organic tool or device forged by humans. Many scientists, particularly physicists and neuroscientists, I think they're making a monumental category error when they claim that organisms and biologies are machines, that neurons are machines. Now, I understand something of how they come to that. But the humans have a problem in which we devastatingly ignorantly, we transfer metaphors from technology back onto organisms. Thus we say, for example, your heart is a pump, your lungs are bellows. Both of these things are impossible, formally impossible. You will not have ideas without your heart. Right? There will be no arguments, no science, no religion, no nothing. There is no pump that produces such effects in time-space. Right? You cannot build a pump that causes ideas, right? Although large language models, some might argue, I think we're getting close, Darren, with LLMs. But LLMs are built by humans, right? So the humans exist in the causal chain of origination necessary to LLMs. So LLMs don't just arise out of the nature of time-space. You have to have humans on Earth, so far as we know. All right, so when I imagine organisms, when I think of organisms, I think of unimaginable complexity, single cell, to simulate it properly at, say, the level of the atom, to fully simulate it would require much more than all the computation humans have ever done. It would require something like 400 million years of the fastest computer we have pinned at its top operating capacity. The Fugaku, I think, is the name of that computer. And again, I'd like to be corrected if I've got this wrong. I think accurately simulating by the way, that's accurately simulating the activity of a cell over 1 second. Okay? So, you're talking about truly monumental enactions of intelligence and physical complexity. And as we attempt to understand how best to simulate a cell, our knowledge of the cell's complexity is increasing very rapidly. So the thing that's increasing more rapidly is the complexity we're facing, not our capacity to simulate it. So when I think of organisms, I think of living beings. We could call them systems, but I prefer to call them relationships. Or relational hyperstructures, or biorelational hyperstructures. And by hyperstructures, I mean a multi-dimensional structure that entangles and complexifies temporalities, not just one temporality, webs of temporality. So that is nothing like a machine. In fact, it might, if we were going to attempt to define the opposite of a machine, organisms and minds would be likely candidates, because organisms, as so far as we understand them, contribute to and sustain negentropic relationships on the surface of living planets, whereas machines dump death into that system in the form of entropy. So machines offload entropy into living systems. Living systems levitate, in a sense. If entropy is gravity, organisms can be imagined as anti-gravity. They do something that should be impossible, or that seems impossible at first glance. And maybe there are biologists who can explain this in such a way as to satisfy my troubled mind about this matter and correct me. I haven't seen evidence of negentropy in machines, and on any planet where those begin to show up, where you have an organism complex enough to produce mechanical objects, it looks to me like, unless that organism is vastly more intelligent than humans in terms of knowing what not to do with technology, you will get a dead world there right quick, geologically speaking. A few thousand years at most. So, unlike Lex Fridman and his ilk, who I respect and admire, and I want his voice at the table, I just don't agree. And I love his podcasts. In fact, the reason I'm making this recording is due to one of them. It's due to his podcast with Lee Cronin and Sarah Walker, who are producing theoretical children if they have not produced physical children. I can't tell if they're a couple or not, and I haven't done the research to figure it out. But listening to them, part of me is just like, oh, please let these two humans mate and produce offspring. Like, I've rarely felt that, though I did feel it with Gene Wilder and Gilda Radner, right? They would have produced an offspring capable of just, laying waste to human consciousness with humor. It would have been like the atomic bomb of comedians. So Lex seems to think that if you get a complex enough machine, it's alive. And if you build a robot, that's your baby. Thus, he projects his own essence into his mechanical creations in a way that he defines as lifelike enough to qualify as life. I think this is a ridiculous misapprehension of the nature of organisms. But, again, I'm excited. I would love to sit down and talk about this with him. Never happened, right? I'm a nobody. Lex is, famous. All right, so let me explain partly why I don't think machines have the same mode of world line that organisms have. It is that they cannot inherit or participate in directly the world line complexity of origination, relation, heredity, and lineage that the simplest organism has more of than all the numbers you could ever make. Right? The simplest organism has an infinite historical relational web of trillions, of endless amounts of numbers of transformations and relationships per instant, whatever interval you want, billionth of a second. And so in a sense, the organism's historical body is transcendentally vast and intimate. And the transactions that the organism, that body has participated in are monumentally vast and supportive generally of nearly all other organisms. Machines, on the other hand, by existing, end the world lines of organisms. Many, many organisms must die to support the existence of any machine, at least around here. And so machines look like, to me, a sort of deadly plague for organisms, generally speaking. They look like the opposite of life. They put an end to organismal lineages. Any automobile is a perfect example of this. That will kill nearly everything it touches, and many things it never touches, in the past and in the future. How does it kill things in the past? By ending the lineages of living beings today. Right? That effectively can be understood to travel back in time and destroy the entire lineage of relationships that produce and exist as, say, a duck run over by a car. All right, so where am I going here? Now, Lex seems to believe that what I will call simulacra are as vital, as potent, as alive as organisms, particularly as we approach the Turing limit of our incapacity to distinguish them. So, if I simulate a philodendron, and you can't tell the difference between that philodendron and an actual philodendron, a living one, it inherits the property alive. This is the argument for Turing tests in artificial cognitive systems, and I never bought it. I'm sure that Lex could table some very fierce objections to my objections. I don't know what they are yet. It has never seemed to me that if you can't tell the difference, they're the same thing. Sure, they're the same thing in terms of the lexical category we are likely to use to refer to them. And yes, if I'm looking at the plants I am walking past, and 87% of them are simulations, and I am unaware of that, then they will seem to me to be plants. But if I discover, okay, then it comes down to, is there any way to determine the distinction? Is there any way to notice the distinction, to experimentally observe the distinction between a simulation and an organism? And I will argue that I don't believe it's possible to produce simulations as complex as organisms at all. There may be exceptions to this, and I'm open to changing my mind. But to me, and one of the things I like about the topic that I'm going to start to blather on about here is that it looks like we may have found a way to measure, to reliably determine the developmental complexity of anything we may observe or interact with. And this is an incredible thing. Now, It may turn out, this is early days for this theory, it may turn out that the theory is falsifiable, or it may turn out that the theory becomes falsified, is what I meant. It's incredibly bold, but of course, like any good scientist, Lee Cronin and his teams, and Sarah Walker, and so forth, who I imagine to be among the parents of assembly theory, like any good scientist, if they're wrong and the theory is formally falsified somehow, we'll get smarter, right? So build the boat, float the boat. If it sinks, okay, we'll make better boats thereafter because of what we learned from this one that sank. But the arguments and data, as I understand, the arguments and the arrangements of data that comprise assembly theory presently look provocatively convincing. And this is where I'm going to get into trouble and be naive and stupid. Because I've only accidentally stumbled onto this topic over the past few weeks. I've listened to a couple of long interviews with Lee Cronin. I'm not mathematically sophisticated enough to understand it the way a scientist understands it. I believe their paper on this theory was published against all odds, right? I think it was published in Nature. And I heard the story of its publication, and I work in that field. I work in the field of editing biomedical manuscripts for publication in what are referred to as high-impact journals, such as Nature, Cell, so forth. So let me see if I can encapsulate meaningfully what I imagine to be the the core positions of assembly theory is something like this. Instead of proposing a new physics, assembly theory, originating, Lee Cronin, I believe, is a chemist. Assembly theory posits a new definition of objects. And so, instead of positing that point particles, electrons, photons, etc., are fundamental, it posits that objects are fundamental and provides a definition of objects. By the way, I'm not reading this. I should be. It provides a definition of objects based on their, on decomposing them and determining the index of complexity required to produce the objects. And this produces models such as causal graphs that are empirical measurements of of timelines, right, of world lines, of objects that are determinative and produce a metric for the complexity of any given object, say a molecule, or an organism, or a machine. And this discovery is absolutely mind-blowing. The number of technologies and ways of knowing that are likely to emerge quickly if this theory is further validated. Obviously, it's fairly well validated to appear in nature. Are staggering. But the thing that I find particularly surprising about it is that it will give us it will give us an empirical measure of various features of organisms that I argue it will give me a way to prove that machines can't participate in how to put it. It is as if there is a living water inside the organisms that is made of their origin and lineage relationships, that is carried forward in time and comprises a dimension of its own. Not only do machines not participate in that specific dimension, they tend to tear it apart and replace it with something that's dead inside, in my view. And, you know, am I an ideologue about this? Partly. I certainly want to learn and be convinced otherwise if that's the direction toward greater insight and intelligence. I fiercely doubt it. I am a biophile, not a technophile. If you wanted to rip the entire history of life on Earth to shreds, all you have to do is give humans machines. They don't have societies intelligent enough to survive that. I would liken it to finding a... Okay, so this is a very abstract analogy, but imagine I have a 2.5-year-old male infant. I abuse it in a variety of ways. This is I'm not suggesting we abuse infants here, but I abuse the infant in a variety of ways that make it very angry. Stop feeding it, give it no attention, yell at it, whatever. And then once it's thoroughly spun up, right, I give it a thermos with no lid, and the thermos contains, I don't know, molten steel, but is so well insulated you can't tell it's hot on the outside. And then I just give the infant the thermos and leave. Right? What is going to happen is going to be really bad for that infant. And similarly, giving humans any kind of technology, this goes to my argument that actually ethical scientists would nearly never publish. Well, that's not going to help the worm. Not really sure what to do about that poor creature. Yeah, actually, ethical scientists would nearly never publish because there are no intelligent There are no intelligent systems of humans competitive enough to prevail against the lethally oriented organizations of humans that will certainly end life on Earth, or at the very least produce an extinction event of staggering scope. Some will argue, yes, extinction events are good. By extinguishing vast arrays of organisms previously, we ourselves arose. Okay, great. But I'm actually concerned about the anciently conserved ecologies. Those things are rare. And there's also a timeline. Just like a human being, a planet has a lifespan, and as it gets nearer to the probable end of its lifespan, the sudden effusive generation of new forms becomes less likely, and the ability to sustain those forms over time becomes less likely. In a sense, it looks to me like the Earth is bioevolutionarily old enough that it has cancer, and the cancer on the Earth is the appearance of machines. Right? These are tumors. They are highly structured modes of time-space, artificially produced, that kill everything so that they can be sustained and reproduced. There's something similar in human cognition that I call thrisps. So I would argue that human cognition has become elderly in the sense that it's no longer producing it produces far more artifacted structure than it does useful, intelligent novelty and relational novelty. Now, assembly theory gives us a variety of metrics and perspectives that would allow us to determine, and by the way, Cronin himself says, I certainly am suffering from the hammer-nail problem. Got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, vis-a-vis assembly theory. And naturally so, because I've never seen a model that could give us the ability to empirically determine so many, like literally to observe that which was previously unobservable. It's almost like assembly theory is a kind of a cognitive lamp that sheds light on features of the universe that we have previously understood to exist but had no way to formalize. That's incredible. So I'm going to try to make a future recording about this in which I am vastly more capable of reiterating some of the root concepts associated with assembly theory. And I have to say that I've been a scientophile? I've loved science since childhood because it looked like one of the ways of knowing that the humans propagate that is relatively likely to produce intelligent understanding, behavior, societies, and so forth. Turns out not the case. At least not in my lifetime. Turns out science is the way of knowing most likely to produce absolute devastation on Earth. And by absolute, I mean the capacity to snuff the biosphere, shut it off like a fucking light switch. And everyone says, oh, there's no way to do that. They're wrong. I could show them 5 ways to do it now. Once you have a certain array of technologies, you will have the capacity to combine them in relatively accessible to single humans or small group ways. This is what Daniel Schmachtenberger's on about with, what's he call it? Multipolar threats. He's got some other nomenclature that's also very useful. Race to the bottom. So yeah, life on, the Earth is very similar to a cell in certain respects, and its robust resilience is absolutely dependent on the continuation of the organs that produce the possibility of homeostasis in the atmosphere and environment. Much like a cell, if you lyse the membrane, you penetrate the membrane of the cell in the right kind of way, the membrane collapses, that planet will die. You'll end up with something not dissimilar to Mars. Now, some will argue that the continuous existence of liquid water on the surface is sufficient to guarantee the continuance of organismal complexification on Earth. Could be right. But for myself, I'm bonded with the anciently conserved ecologies in my heart, mind, and spirit. Science turns out to be the way of knowing that will allow humans to dispose of those. And in a sense, causes them to dispose of them by continuously producing new technologies that infectively in other words, that continuously penetrate new dimensions of the organs of the biosphere and offload entropy into them. This doesn't mean I'm anti-science. Science is one of the most reliable ways of knowing that we have. However, science is also heavily compromised by malignant imperatives that that propagate like a kind of mold in human culture, right? And then those imperatives capture ways of knowing and weaponize them for the sake of profit, power, or decimation, right? Obliterating things, crushing the opponent, zero-sum games. Yeah. So science is still half noble, or a tenth noble, but most of what science will actually produce is likely to further human technological development, which looks to me lethal to both humans and the history and future of life on Earth. And whether or not it completely obliterates life on Earth sort of doesn't matter, right? If I murder your entire family and one of your children manages somehow to survive, this does not this doesn't validate my murder, or the murder of the entire family. I guess there was some Russian royal family that was essentially like captured up, taken somewhere, and just executed. I can't remember who, the Romanovs maybe. And the fact that some, janitor survived in no way reduces the atrocity index of the slaughter of the family and the children and everybody. And I think it's funny that it's natural, but it's also peculiar that we pretend that, it's relatively okay to kill the adults. They had some life. Just don't kill the children and keep some women around. That's that kind of moral relativism doesn't fly well with me. I think all of the beings, all of the adults are still children too. There's very few, if any, statuses that ameliorate the moral or ethical imperatives that orbit do not kill, and especially do not murder, do not slaughter. So, back to assembly theory. So there are two particular forms of data that, and by the way, I deeply encourage you to listen to Lee Cronin describing the origins and publication of the assembly theory paper. I may be able to produce a link in the description later. But the two primary forms of data that emerge that I understand to some degree at this point are what's called the assembly index, which is a measure of the necessary extant complexity required for an object to become possible in the universe. Now that, by the way, Cronin says that time turns out to be fundamental to anything relating to analyzing objects. And I agree with him that at least through the lens of assembly theory and a number of lenses familiar and preferable to me, time is something far different from tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. In fact, organisms and their relationships create modes of time. I refer to these as biorelational hyperstructures or biotemporal hyperstructures. And when idiots, or when when people make idiotic statements, and I've heard both Neil deGrasse Tyson and Sabine Hassenfelder, I'm not sure if I got her last name right, make bold and idiotic claims such as there's no reason for aliens to travel, millions of light years, thousands of light years to visit the Earth because humans are boring. That is the epitome. Hi, nice to see you. That is the epitome of egoic anthropocentric stupidity, in my view. And maybe they're stirring the pot, right? Maybe they're just trying to produce trigger bait. But the Earth is a vast library of biorelational hyperstructures. These must be incredibly rare in time-space by volume, even if they are common in number, right? Even if there are billions of living worlds as complex as ours, as stable as ours, stable enough to produce hands, eyes, wings, tentacles, minds, so forth. embodied minds. Those things are not merely interesting, they are producing modes of time-space that if you... it's like looking for diamonds or looking for gold, right? Walk all over the place, you will find nearly no gold. In the entire history of me walking around on the earth, the only diamonds I've seen are on women's fingers, generally, or men's. Or, unfortunately, in the latter part of my life, inside people's teeth. Come on, people. You guys nuts? Apparently. So yeah, living worlds produce forms of biotemporal complexity that are unimaginably uncommon in time-space, even if there are lots of them. And each one of them will have incredibly unique features. So, for shame, Tyson, you are acting the public idiot here in an anthropocentric and egoic way that is truly embarrassing, not just to you, but to the idea that you're a scientist. And similarly, Sabine, what the hell are you thinking? You think the humans are the only reason to visit Earth? I mean, as a human, are you only interested in the humans? The fuck are you thinking? And again, maybe these people are just trying to produce trigger bait. They certainly succeeded in my case. Because I was like, if I was capable of publicly slapping them in the face for such a comment, I might be willing to descend to that. Yeah, I find that just ridiculous, and it does stir me up if I'm willing to be stirred up that way. So the two concepts in assembly theory are the assembly index of an object, which is an empirical measure of, it's like a graph, I guess, or there's actually a second concept, which is the causal graph. And I think I sort of understand the assembly index as a measure of the complexity necessary in the temporal historical context of the universe to produce, for an object to be constructed somehow. And then the causal graph is a bit more obscure. Let me see if I can find the definition for that. I suppose the causal graph is a way of encoding propositions about the paths of origination of an object. Now again, assembly theory is very new. A lot of scientists are quite upset about its existence. I mean, there's a vast population of haters already for this theory because it, in some senses, if properly validated, it might comprise a super science, right? Something that steals the foundations from many other branches of research. It just captures those foundations. And it's very early days. There remains a great deal of work to do. However, one problem with Sir, your dog, it's having trouble. It has, yeah, there you go. Yeah, it was just walking funny because it was trying to. um, so, whether or not assembly theory is validated, it's already producing uncommonly useful results. And in listening to Cronin, I've, spent some time listening to intelligent humans, and particularly intelligent males. I guess just because the media puts more of them in front of me, generally speaking, right? However, Sarah Walker is a wonderful example of an absolutely brilliant intellectual female. I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to use explicit gender terms in 2024. I may end up canceled or beheaded for having done so. But yeah, Lee is one of the most intelligent minds I've ever had the pleasure of listening to. This doesn't mean that I agree with everything he says or believes. And in fact, one of the reasons I find him intelligent is you will very commonly hear him say, I've just changed my mind about this. This is something I've nearly never heard out of the mouths of anyone. And even in the interview with Lex Fridman, where he and Sarah Walker, the interview is ostensibly about aliens. There's, I don't know, there's like 8 minutes of talk about aliens in the interview, and it's 4 hours long, which is awesome. As most of you know, I'm down with long form. Let's do it long form, Let's have the foreplay for hours, and then, all the other stuff, and then the meal, and then the bath, and then, the dreaming, and then, everything. Let's have it all. Of course, I'm not getting any of that stuff. That's all pure fantasy at this, in my present circumstances, and has long been that way. Maybe that's why maybe that's why I have changed my perspective. But my point was just that, I can see if you can give Lee an argument that allows him to visualize, particularly to visualize experiments that can be done to determine qualitatively, quantitatively, empirically, ideologically, the validity of an argument, or the power of an argument, the conclusiveness of an argument. He will immediately change his mind if he can see and understand the structure. And I've rarely seen this quality. I'm not sure I have it. I'm very likely to be committed to my pet theories. And I encounter so few intelligent people to explore with that it's uncommon for me to be presented with something I find wow. Coughing child, death knell. The child will probably survive. But who else will? I don't encounter anyone intelligent enough or motivated to push against. Commonly, there There are a few such people in my circle. The most profound tree that I know lives in this little part of the garden. I'm going to pause for a moment. I will return. So I've noticed that someone, I can't recall the guy's name, just saw it briefly, has published an essay on Medium called The 8 Fallacies of Assembly Theory. Definitely people are going to be highly motivated to attack this thing, which is probably good. I mean, I think Cronin himself and Sarah Walker would, and they have other associates, Sharma et al. You can see their team on the primary paper. So the thing is going to undergo a radical evolutionary process by furious objection. People are going to be very highly motivated to attack this thing, primarily because if it turns out to be valid or useful, which it seems extremely likely to be profoundly useful in the sense that it gives us ways to detect the existence of stuff that we've never been able to see before. Like, it's not merely a new language. It's a new method of considering the nature of identity, what things are. And this is incredibly provocative and profound. I mean, literally, my mind is so blown by what I've heard from Cronin that, I mean, one analogy would be if so in some ways, as someone who has reason to suspect that I've had long-term contact over some interval of my life with a non-human intelligence of extremely exotic and profound nature and ability. It's not dissimilar to someone who says, you know, not only did one day out in the field at night my family and I encountered what appeared to us to be a vehicle from time-space. But they took me with them in their vehicle, and they taught me some of their ways of knowing, right, over many months, and showed me how they perceive the universe, organisms, time, space, all these things. So in a sense, compared to the minds of common others around me, my mind is a bit like a UFO landing in their backyard. because I'm attempting to convey some of the some of the perspectives and orientations that I've acquired over my lifetime, but particularly during my contact experience. And there's lots of different ways to conceive of that experience other than contact with a non-human intelligence, though I would argue that most of what's going on is precisely that, because nature is a non-human intelligence of unimaginable sophistication. And a library of such intelligences that upscale form a unity. And by the way, it looks like assembly theory might endow the possibility of proving empirically that the Earth and the biosphere comprise a unity, an accessible to humans unity, and many other things that are important, philosophically, ethically, morally, and intellectually to me, perhaps even spiritually. I will admit that I associate my biophilia, my adoration of living beings and their relationships and origins. That does feel to me like a spiritual faculty. Or an expression of my soul, of the nature of my soul, which I imagine is a much more complex entity than is commonly supposed. That thing's got a lot of different features depending on how and why we may be referring to it in language or making models in language, concepts and so on. I'm going to pause for a bit because I'm coming to a place of a lot of noise. With luck, I will return shortly. So I hope in the future to be able to produce a concise description of assembly theory and its primary propositions. But it looks like we may get a grasp on an entirely new form of knowledge with the power to produce otherwise impossible insights about a broad array of features of biology, and particularly some of the most confusing problems in sciences concerned with origin of life. I have recently been listening to some debates on this topic, and they are profoundly contentious, primarily because the common models in play in biology are ridiculous and avoid nearly all of the fundamental questions necessary to produce reasonable scientific arguments. Assembly theory may give us both a foundation for reasonable arguments and a path to evaluate them in the laboratory, right? Cronin has a variety of radical and I think trustworthy ideas about what we might do to produce both the precursors and perhaps actual life in the lab. Again, from my view, Lee, if he's correct, and his team, and Sarah and her team, or their teams, are giving the humans, again, something very likely to produce incredibly lethal technologies. Scientists often inhabit the role of the villain in Frederick Brown's story, The Weapon, in which a journalist comes to visit a scientist who's about to give the humans something similarly deadly to nuclear weapons. The journalist argues against this. The scientist just says, it's not my job to determine whether or not something should be done. My job is to do what can be done. I can do this. I'm going to do it. It turns out that the scientist has a developmentally inhibited child not sure what the right nomenclature for that is these days. A child who is 12 but has the mental age that might be associated with a 3-year-old. And the journalist manages to give the child a loaded gun surreptitiously, which the scientist later finds him with in his bed. It's a powerful refutation of the argument we should do what we can. Whatever can be done should be done. Right? No, absolutely it should not be done. There are all kinds of things we can't do that we must never do. And in fact, it turns out that much of what is productive and supportive and crucial to what I mean when I use the word intelligence, much of that is prohibitive. It's what must not be done for it to continue to be possible for us to be intelligent. Or to exist at all. Obviously, if you're not existing, you can't be intelligent anymore. So I hope to return with a more educated perspective on assembly theory, but I want to encourage my listeners to explore it because honestly, it looks like a discovery with the potential to have more impact than relativity did, or at least a discovery of a similar degree of impact. If it isn't defeated, it will change the face of science as far as I can see from my current understandings of it. So for example, there's a degree of demonstrable complexity in a system that is demonstrative of the activity, interference, or origination by an intelligent being or system. In a sense, here we might find proof of God, but we might also be able to just look at nearly anything in the universe. And, look, God is in quotes. I think it's my perspective that time-space itself is, while not being fundamental, right, something productive of time-space, it is the result of a transcendent a layered array of transiences in nature, in existence. A moment. So assembly theory may give us the ability to empirically determine whether it is possible for most of what exists, or any specific element, to have originated without the interference or creative engagement of some intelligence or transcendence. Now, I may be misunderstanding that, but from what I can tell from what I heard, there's a specific sort of cutoff point in the assembly index or the causal graph of an object that is determinate, empirically determinate of whether or not it could have come into existence without being purposefully or purposefully or tangentially resulting from purposeful activity. And there may be some overlap here with other ideas. For example, Cronin sneers at Sheldrake's morphogenesis, and yet there seems to be some conceptual overlap. It may be very minimal, but there seems to be some conceptual overlap between assembly theory and Sheldrake's concepts, to me. Because it may well turn out, for example, that in a given possibility space, once you assemble the first salt crystal locally, it now becomes easy to, in Cronin's language, teleport the properties to other objects. And that resembles the results of Sheldrake's theory of morphogenesis. So there's much more to learn here. I'm going to be spending some time digesting more about assembly theory. And I encourage those of you who are interested to explore it. It looks, either it's going to get defeated completely, in which case it will produce no useful results, which seems impossible to me, by the way. Or it will get partially defeated in that it is not its scope will undergo radical limitation. Or we have a new way of understanding objects, identity, interactions, and historical development of such matters. And it looks pretty likely that that's what's actually going to happen so far. So, thank you all for joining me. I look forward to learning and growing and seeing better together again sometime in the very near future. May your ways and lives be beautiful, blessed, insightful, playful, and joyful. Bye-bye for now.